Hello everyone, I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to guide you through tonight's journey. I know many of you use these videos to help you unwind or drift off to sleep. So before we begin, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind relax. The trip started out as a fun getaway. My friends and I had been planning a camping trip for months, a weekend away from work, the city, and the everyday chaos of life. There were 5 of us: Ryan, Sam, Lily, Jake, and me. We all loved the idea of being surrounded by nothing but trees and stars, disconnected from technology and civilization, if only for a few days. After hours of driving, we finally reached the edge of the forest. The place was isolated, far from any town, and we hadn't seen another car for miles. We gathered our backpacks and supplies, double-checking that we had everything we needed. There was something eerie about the dense forest, but we brushed it off as excitement and set off down a narrow trail, deeper into the woods. The first day was perfect. We found a spot to set up our tents, right by a small lake surrounded by towering pine trees. The water was crystal clear, and everything around us was still almost too quiet. We spent the afternoon fishing, hiking, and sharing stories around a campfire as night fell. As the sun set, casting long shadows over the camp, an unsettling silence settled around us. The usual sounds of nature, crickets, frogs, even the rustle of leaves, seemed to fade away. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the shadows. "Anyone else feel like we're being watched?" Lily asked, breaking the silence. Ryan laughed, trying to lighten the mood. "Probably just some raccoons or a curious deer. Don't worry, Lil," he said, but his forced smile told me he felt the same unease. We all settled into our tents for the night, but sleep didn't come easily. Around midnight I heard it, the sound of footsteps, soft but deliberate, circling the campsite. I froze, holding my breath, listening. At first I thought it was one of my friends, but the footsteps didn't stop. They moved slowly, deliberately, as if someone was carefully circling the tents, checking each one. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer wandering close, but the steps were too heavy, too steady. They stopped right outside my tent. I lay there, heart pounding, barely daring to breathe. After a few minutes, the footsteps moved away, fading into the forest. The next morning, I asked if anyone else had heard the sounds, but they all shook their heads. Lily looked a bit pale, but she insisted she hadn't heard anything. We tried to brush it off, but a tension lingered, a silent agreement that something didn't feel right. That day, we hiked further into the woods, exploring the area around the lake. The forest was dense, with twisted branches and underbrush that made it easy to lose sight of the trail. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, a dark figure slipping between the trees just out of sight. But whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. Sam was the first to speak up. "Guys, is it just me, or is someone following us?" Jake laughed it off, but his nervous glance over his shoulder betrayed his real feelings. We all started to feel it. The prickling sensation at the back of our necks, the sense of eyes on us from the shadows. We decided to head back to camp, hoping that the feeling would pass once we were out in the open. That night, the tension reached a breaking point. We sat around the campfire, sharing nervous glances, barely speaking. As the fire crackled, casting long shadows across the ground, we heard it again, the soft, deliberate footsteps just beyond the circle of light. Ryan stood up, holding a flashlight, and pointed it toward the trees. "Hello?" he called, his voice echoing through the silent forest. No answer. The footsteps stopped, but the silence was oppressive, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Ryan scanned the trees with his flashlight, but there was nothing there. Just darkness. We decided to turn in early, each of us retreating to the safety of our tents. But sleep was impossible. I lay awake, listening, every nerve on edge. Around 2 a.m. I heard it again, The footsteps, closer this time, and something else. A low, raspy whisper, like someone speaking just loud enough to be heard. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone sent chills down my spine. It sounded like laughter, faint and mocking, drifting through the trees. Suddenly, Sam's voice broke the silence. "Did you guys hear that?" We all scrambled out of our tents, gathering by the dying embers of the fire, each of us wide-eyed and shaken. "There's someone out there," Lily whispered, clutching her flashlight. I think I saw someone watching us." We stood in tense silence, scanning the trees, but there was nothing. Just darkness and the oppressive quiet of the forest. Then, just as we started to relax, we heard it again. The footsteps, moving closer, circling us in the dark. Panicked, we grabbed our flashlights and shone them into the trees. The beam of light caught something, a figure standing just beyond the reach of the light, half hidden by the shadows. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing dark clothes that blended into the night. His face was obscured, but we could see the glint of his eyes, watching us with an unsettling intensity. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring. "Who are you?" Jake shouted, his voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. He simply raised a hand, waving slowly, almost mockingly, before disappearing into the trees. We stood frozen, too shocked to move. When the figure was finally gone, we bolted back to the tents, grabbing our belongings in a frenzy. No one wanted to stay another minute in that forest. We packed up in record time, the adrenaline pushing us forward. The whole time we felt watched, the figure's silent presence haunting us from the shadows. As we made our way back to the car, the whispers followed us, echoing through the trees like ghostly laughter. When we finally reached the car, we piled in and sped down the road, not daring to look back. No one spoke the entire drive home, each of us lost in our own thoughts, trying to process what we had experienced. To this day, none of us can fully explain what happened in that forest. We tried to rationalize it, telling ourselves it was just our imagination, or maybe a prankster trying to scare us. But deep down, we all knew the truth. There was someone, or something, out there in those woods, watching us. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear the sound of those footsteps, that faint mocking laughter echoing in my mind. I haven't been back to the woods since. None of us have, and we never will. It was supposed to be a dream home, a quiet retreat far away from the noise of city life. My wife Claire and I had spent months searching for the perfect place. Then one day we found it. A Victorian house tucked away in the countryside, surrounded by tall trees and a thick, overgrown garden. It was perfect, just what we needed to start fresh. The house was older than we expected, but that only added to its charm. The wooden floors creaked underfoot, and the walls were adorned with faded wallpaper that hinted at a time long gone. We both felt an immediate connection to the house, and the deal was done. The first few weeks were blissful. We spent our days unpacking, exploring the property, and getting to know the neighborhood. But something felt off, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. At night, when the house settled, I would hear faint sounds coming from the walls, soft whispers, like someone talking just out of earshot. I tried to dismiss it, thinking it was just the house settling, but the whispers became more frequent, more insistent. One night, I woke up to the sound of whispers that seemed too real to ignore. I glanced over at Claire, but she was still fast asleep, her breathing steady. The whispers were coming from the walls, low, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to be right next to me. My heart began to race as I sat up in bed, straining my ears to listen. "Hello?" I whispered into the darkness, but the whispers didn't stop. In fact, they grew louder, more frantic. I turned on the bedside lamp, but the moment the light flickered to life, the whispers stopped. I lay there wide-eyed, trying to calm my racing thoughts. When morning came, I told Claire about what happened. She laughed it off, thinking it was just a bad dream, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As the days passed, the whispers grew more persistent. It wasn't just at night anymore. I would hear them during the day too, when I was alone in the house. Sometimes they sounded like muffled voices, other times like someone was crying softly from inside the walls. But whenever I tried to investigate, there was nothing there. One afternoon, I decided to take a closer look. I began pulling off the wallpaper in the hallway, hoping to find some sort of clue as to what was causing the strange sounds. As I peeled back the layers of old paper, I found something strange. In the wall behind the wallpaper, there was a small hidden door, a door I had never noticed before. It was old, weathered, and covered in dust. I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened the door, and inside I found a narrow, pitch-black staircase leading down into the darkness. The air smelled damp, musty, as if the room hadn't been touched in years. With a deep breath, I grabbed a flashlight and began to descend. The staircase creaked beneath my weight as I moved further down, the beam of light barely illuminating the walls. The whispers were louder now, coming from below. They seemed to be calling to me, urging me forward. The staircase led to a small stone chamber. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols that I didn't recognize. At the center of the room was a large, cracked mirror, its surface covered in dust and grime. But as I stepped closer, I saw something in the reflection, something that made my blood run cold. The mirror didn't reflect the room behind me. Instead, it showed a dark, endless corridor, stretching out into an infinite void. And in the distance, I could make out the faintest silhouette of a figure, standing motionless, watching me. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. As I turned to leave, I felt a cold hand brush against my shoulder. I whipped around, but there was no one there. The whispers grew louder, now mingled with soft, guttural growls. I bolted up the stairs, slamming the hidden door shut behind me. When I returned to the main part of the house, I was shaken, breathless, and covered in a cold sweat. Claire was sitting in the living room, reading a book. She looked up as I entered, her face filled with concern. "What happened? You look like you've seen a ghost," she said. I couldn't bring myself to tell her everything. How could I? She wouldn't believe me. Instead, I simply told her that I'd found something strange in the basement and that I didn't want to go back down there. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the whispers, so close now that they felt like they were right next to my ear. I could hear them calling my name, urging me to come back. It felt like the house was alive, alive with something dark, something ancient. The next day, I decided to investigate further. I went back down into the basement, determined to find out what was going on. This time I brought Claire with me. When we reached the hidden door, I hesitated for a moment before opening it again. To my shock, the staircase had disappeared. The narrow stairs were now a solid wall of brick, as if they had never existed. I ran my hand along the wall, searching for the door, but there was nothing there. That night, the whispers returned, louder than ever. They filled the house, echoing in every room. Claire was still asleep beside me when I heard it. The soft, low growl of something moving in the walls. The sound came closer and closer, until I felt it right next to me, as if something was crawling through the walls, circling me. Suddenly, the door to our bedroom creaked open, and the figure from the mirror, the same silhouette I had seen in the reflection, stepped into the room. It was tall, its form shadowy and indistinct, but its eyes were glowing, watching me with an intensity that sent a wave of terror through my body. I reached for Claire, trying to wake her, but when I looked at her, her face was frozen in an expression of terror. She was staring at something behind me. When I turned around, the figure was gone, but the whispers remained. I never saw Claire again after that night. When I woke up, she was gone, vanished without a trace. I searched the house, tearing apart every room, every corner, but she was nowhere to be found. I stayed in the house for another week, hoping that somehow I could make sense of what had happened. But every night the whispers grew louder, more frantic, until I could no longer bear it. Eventually I left, abandoning the house and everything in it. But the whispers followed me. They never stopped. To this day, I still hear them, soft, insistent whispers, calling me back to that house. I know now that I will never escape. Working the night shift at a gas station might sound boring to most, but to me, it was the perfect job. I didn't mind the quiet, and the extra pay for covering the late hours didn't hurt. Most nights I'd spend the hours alone, scrolling through my phone, sipping lukewarm coffee, and occasionally filling up the tanks for the rare customer. Station 14 was on the outskirts of town, surrounded by miles of empty road and open fields. It was the kind of place that felt completely cut off from the world after midnight. But, as I quickly learned, Station 14 was anything but boring. My first strange experience happened only a few weeks after I started. It was around 2 a.m., the time when the world feels emptiest. I was sweeping the floor near the entrance when I saw someone standing just outside, staring through the glass door. I hadn't heard a car pull up, and the security cameras showed nothing but an empty lot. The man wore a long dark coat and had his hood up, obscuring his face. He didn't move, didn't blink. He just stared at me through the glass, like he was waiting for something. I felt a chill run down my spine. My hand hovered over the door lock, but something held me back. Instead, I tried to wave at him, hoping he would react, maybe even leave. But he didn't. He just kept standing there, motionless. I turned away for just a second to grab my phone, but when I looked back, he was gone. There was no sign of him outside. No footprints, no car sounds, nothing. I chalked it up to sleep deprivation or a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew it wasn't either. A few nights later, I was in the middle of refilling the chip racks when I heard it, the faint sound of tapping, coming from the back of the store. At first I thought it was the wind, but the taps had a rhythm to them, too precise to be random. I followed the sound to the storage room. I'd always hated that room. It was cramped, cold, and smelled faintly of mildew. As I stood outside the door, the tapping stopped. I hesitated, hand hovering over the doorknob, and then I heard it again, a soft, low whisper coming from inside. "Come in." Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to see what was inside. I took a deep breath, twisted the doorknob, and stepped into the darkness. The room was empty. But just as I was about to turn around, the door slammed shut behind me. I lunged at the doorknob, trying to wrench it open, but it wouldn't budge. Panic rose in my chest as I banged on the door, shouting for help. After what felt like an eternity, the door suddenly swung open on its own, and I stumbled out, gasping for breath. No one was there. The station was silent. The tapping and whispering had vanished. I took the rest of the night on edge, jumping at every little sound. The encounters became more frequent after that. It started with small things, items moving on their own, the lights flickering, or hearing faint footsteps when I knew I was alone. I tried to brush it off as exhaustion, but the occurrences were too real to ignore. One night, around 3 a.m., I was filling the coffee machine when I saw something in the reflection of the glass door. A figure stood behind me, just out of reach, watching me. My heart skipped a beat. I whipped around, but the aisle was empty. The next night, I decided to call the manager. I tried to explain everything. The man outside, the tapping, the whispering. But she just laughed, telling me I was imagining things. "There's nothing wrong with that station," she said dismissively. "You're just not used to the night shift." Frustrated but determined, I went back to work, telling myself it was all in my head. But deep down, I knew that something wasn't right with Station 14. Then, about a month into the job, things escalated. It was another quiet night, and I was in the middle of restocking the shelves when I heard the sound of footsteps, heavy and slow, coming from the back of the store. I froze, heart pounding, straining to hear. The footsteps were getting closer, moving up the aisle, one deliberate step at a time. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely a whisper. The footsteps stopped. I waited, holding my breath, but there was only silence. Then, without warning, the power went out. The store was plunged into darkness, and the only light came from the faint glow of the emergency exit sign near the back door. I pulled out my phone, turning on the flashlight, and began to make my way to the breaker room. As I walked, I heard something behind me, a faint whisper, too soft to make out, but unmistakably there. I spun around, shining my light down the aisle, but there was no one there. I took a step back, trying to steady my nerves, when I felt a cold hand grab my shoulder. I whipped around, shining the light in all directions, but again, there was no one. I bolted to the breaker room, nearly tripping over myself as I threw the switch, flooding the store with light. The final night at Station 14 was the worst. It was around 4 a.m., just before the morning shift was set to arrive. I was counting down the minutes, eager to leave, when I saw him, the man in the dark coat, standing outside the door, staring in at me. His face was clearer this time, pale and expressionless, with dark, hollow eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. I stared back, frozen in place, my body refusing to move. Slowly, he raised his hand and pointed at me, his expression never changing. Without thinking, I locked the door and turned off the lights, hoping he would go away. But when I looked back, he was inside the store, standing at the end of the aisle, watching me. I don't know how he got in. I didn't hear the door open, didn't see him move. He was just there, like he'd always been there. I ran, heart pounding, and hid behind the counter. I could hear his footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the aisles. Every few steps, he would stop, like he was listening, waiting. I clamped my hand over my mouth, trying to keep quiet, but I could feel the panic rising. His footsteps grew louder, closer, until he was right behind the counter. I could feel his presence, cold and heavy, like a shadow pressing down on me. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I looked up, and he was gone. The store was empty, the silence almost deafening. When the morning shift arrived, I quit on the spot. I didn't bother explaining. I knew they wouldn't believe me, just like the manager hadn't. I left that station, and I never looked back. But sometimes, late at night, I still feel those eyes watching me, the memory of cold fingers brushing my shoulder. And every now and then, I hear footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing in the quiet. I haven't been back to Station 14 since, and I pray I never see that man again. For years, I worked the late shift at Station 24. It wasn't a glamorous job, but the pay was decent, and I liked the quiet of the night. It gave me time to think. Our gas station was small, located off a lonely highway that most people didn't travel after dark. The occasional trucker would stop by, or sometimes someone on a long drive. But mostly, I was alone. I'd always thought I could handle the solitude. But one night changed everything. It was a typical quiet night. I was sitting behind the counter, sipping coffee and scrolling through my phone, when I heard the faint chime of the doorbell. I looked up, but no one was there. The station was empty, as it had been for hours. I figured it might have been the wind, as sometimes the door was finicky. A few minutes later, I heard it again. Ding. This time, I felt a chill creep down my spine. I checked the security camera feed, but the screen showed only an empty lot bathed in the glow of the station lights. I went to the door, looked outside, and saw nothing. No cars, no movement, only silence. I shook it off and went back inside, but a sense of unease began to settle over me. An hour later, I was restocking the shelves when I heard a faint rustling sound. I turned, expecting to see a stray animal or maybe some trash that had blown in, but it was coming from the back of the store where the storeroom door was. The door had a habit of sticking, so I was certain it had been shut. Curious, I made my way toward the sound. As I reached the storeroom door, I heard a soft voice, a faint whisper coming from inside. "Help me." I froze. My heart began pounding as I listened closer, but there was nothing. Just silence. I slowly turned the knob and pushed the door open, but the room was empty. Just stacks of boxes, cold shelves, and that smell of stale air that never quite went away. The whispering had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was there. I locked the storeroom and went back to the counter, trying to brush it off as my imagination. But as the night went on, the strange incidents continued. I'd hear faint footsteps moving through the aisles, the sound of items falling off the shelves, and once, a low humming that echoed through the station. Around 3 a.m., I saw him, the figure. I was counting down the minutes until my shift ended when, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed someone standing at the edge of the station's parking lot. He was tall and wore a dark coat, his face obscured in shadow. He stood perfectly still, just watching. I waved, trying to act casual, but he didn't respond. He just kept standing there, motionless. I couldn't make out his face, but there was something unnerving about his presence. I looked down at the register for just a moment, and when I looked back, he was gone. That night, I started keeping a journal of the strange occurrences at Station 24. Over the next few weeks, the events only got worse. Every night, I'd hear the whispers, the footsteps, the strange rustling sounds coming from the storeroom. I began to dread going to work, the isolation of the station now feeling like a trap. One night, around 2 a.m., I decided to check the security footage from previous nights. As I scrolled through the videos, my heart sank. In nearly every frame, there was a dark figure lingering just at the edge of the camera's view, always standing, always watching, but never coming closer. It was as if he knew where the cameras couldn't see him. The following night, I was behind the counter, lost in thought, when I felt a sudden chill. The temperature seemed to drop, and the lights began to flicker. I looked up, and there he was, standing inside the station, at the end of the aisle. The figure was closer than ever, his face still hidden in shadow. But this time, I could see a twisted smile, faint but unmistakable. I stumbled backward, nearly knocking over a display of chips. I blinked, and he was gone. The next morning, I finally decided to quit. I couldn't take it anymore. I told my manager about the strange occurrences, but she just laughed it off, saying I was probably just tired. She had no idea how real it felt, how terrifying it had become. On my last night at Station 24, I could feel that something was off. The air felt thick, heavy with a sense of anticipation, like something was waiting. I tried to keep busy, counting down the hours until my final shift would be over. Around 4 a.m., just as I was starting to relax, the power went out. The station was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from my flashlight. I stood there, heart pounding, when I heard it, the faint sound of someone breathing just behind me. I turned, shining my flashlight around, but there was no one there. The breathing continued, getting louder, closer, until I could feel it right next to my ear. Then, a voice, soft, mocking, and too close. "Don't leave." I dropped my flashlight and ran for the door, fumbling with my keys, desperate to get out. As I stumbled outside into the night, I turned back to look through the glass door. Standing there in the center of the store was the dark figure, his shadowy face twisted into a menacing smile. The lights flickered back on, and he vanished. I never returned to Station 24 after that. I don't know who or what haunted that place, but I know it was real. Some nights, I still wake up, heart racing, feeling like someone is watching me from the shadows. But every time I close my eyes, I see him, standing at the end of the aisle, smiling. My best friend Alex had always been obsessed with horror. He'd spend hours watching scary movies, reading ghost stories, and diving into the creepiest online forums he could find. But his favorite hobby was exploring abandoned places, convinced that each one held some kind of dark secret or haunting history. I wasn't as into it as he was, but he had a way of talking me into going along on these adventures. One Saturday night, Alex called me up, his voice brimming with excitement. He'd found an old, deserted house on the outskirts of town, one he'd heard stories about for years but had never had the chance to explore. Locals called it the Willow Creek House, a decaying mansion that supposedly held a tragic history of disappearances and paranormal sightings. I wanted to say no, to find any excuse not to go, but Alex was relentless. Before I knew it, I was in his car, heading out to the haunted house. When we arrived, the place looked every bit as eerie as the stories had described. The Willow Creek house stood isolated, surrounded by overgrown trees and shrouded in fog. The wooden walls were covered in ivy, and many of the windows were shattered, giving it a dark, hollow appearance. The air was cold, and I felt a chill even before we stepped inside. The door creaked loudly as Alex pushed it open. Inside, the house was a maze of narrow hallways and empty rooms, all covered in layers of dust. Shadows danced on the walls as our flashlights swept across the peeling wallpaper and broken furniture. The silence was thick, broken only by the occasional sound of a loose floorboard beneath our feet. As we wandered further in, Alex started telling me the story he'd heard about the place. Decades ago, a family had lived here, a father, mother, and their young daughter. One night, the parents vanished without a trace, leaving the daughter alone in the house. When the neighbors finally checked in, they found her hiding in a closet, terrified and whispering about the shadow people that had come for her parents. She was eventually taken away, but rumors persisted that her parents' spirits never left the house. I tried to brush off the story as just another urban legend, but the unsettling feeling in my chest only grew. As we continued exploring, I couldn't shake the sense that we weren't alone. The shadows seemed to shift in the corners of my vision, and strange sounds echoed through the empty halls. Whispers too faint to understand, and the occasional creak from somewhere far away. We entered what looked like the old dining room, a grand space with a long dust-covered table at its center. Chairs were scattered around, some overturned, as if whoever had been sitting in them had left in a hurry. The air was thick with a damp, musty smell. Alex grinned, clearly thrilled by the atmosphere. Then, as he was snapping photos, I saw it, a faint outline in the corner of the room, something moving just at the edge of the flashlight's beam. My heart skipped a beat, and I nudged Alex, trying to point it out. "What?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Over there," I replied, barely able to get the words out. He shined his flashlight toward the corner, but the figure had vanished. He chuckled, brushing it off as my imagination, but I could see the nervousness in his eyes. We made our way to the second floor, where we found an old child's bedroom. Toys were scattered across the floor, coated in dust, and a small broken rocking chair sat near the window. Alex, fascinated by the details, picked up one of the toys, a small, ragged doll with a cracked porcelain face. The second he touched it, the air in the room seemed to drop several degrees. A chill ran down my spine, and I suddenly felt like we were being watched. "Maybe we should put that down," I suggested, but Alex just laughed, brushing off my fear. Just then, we heard it, a soft, rhythmic creaking sound coming from behind us. We turned slowly to see the rocking chair moving on its own, swaying back and forth as if someone had just sat in it. I felt frozen in place, barely able to breathe. Alex's confident expression faded, replaced by a look of uncertainty. The chair creaked faster, the sound echoing in the empty room, and then, just as suddenly, it stopped. We both took a step back, ready to bolt, when the door behind us slammed shut. Alex ran to it, desperately trying to open it, but it wouldn't budge. That's when we heard it, a soft, childlike giggle echoing from somewhere in the room. Panicking, I scanned the room, trying to find the source of the sound. My flashlight landed on a small wardrobe in the corner, the door slightly ajar. Something inside seemed to be moving, shuffling in the darkness. Alex and I looked at each other, our fear finally overtaking our curiosity. Just as I was about to suggest breaking a window to escape, the wardrobe door slowly opened wider, and a shadowy figure emerged. It was small, no taller than a child, but its eyes glowed with an unnatural, empty light. It stood there, watching us, its face blank and expressionless. Without another word, we both bolted for the door, pounding on it with all our strength. After a few desperate moments, the door finally gave way, and we stumbled into the hallway. But the house wasn't done with us yet. As we made our way to the stairs, I felt something cold wrap around my ankle. I looked down, and there, wrapped around my leg, was a small, pale hand reaching out from beneath the floorboards. I screamed, kicking frantically until I broke free. We dashed down the stairs, not daring to look back. The whispers were louder now, filling the house with an eerie chorus of voices that seemed to come from every direction. When we finally burst through the front door, the night air felt like a relief. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. Once inside, we sat in stunned silence, trying to catch our breath. Neither of us spoke for a long time, each of us processing what we had just experienced. Eventually, Alex broke the silence. I didn't think it was real, he whispered, his voice shaking. I didn't have the words to respond. All I knew was that we'd encountered something beyond explanation, something that didn't want us there, and I had no intention of ever going back. Since that night, Alex hasn't been the same. He's quieter, more reserved, and hasn't mentioned his obsession with horror or exploring abandoned places again. And as for me, I'll never forget the sight of that childlike shadow, or the chilling feel of that hand around my ankle. Every now and then, when I'm alone at night, I think I hear that soft, childlike giggle echoing in the darkness, a reminder of the horrors lurking in places best left undisturbed. When my friends and I decided to take a road trip to Hollow Beach, we were expecting sun, sand, and a carefree weekend. The beach was known for its beautiful cliffs and the shimmering, dark blue water that stretched as far as the eye could see. There were whispers about Hollow Beach being haunted, tales of strange happenings and lost swimmers, but we shrugged them off as local folklore. None of us believed in ghosts, at least not until that weekend. The drive to Hollow Beach was full of laughter and excitement. We arrived as the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with shades of pink and orange. The beach was completely deserted, which felt like a stroke of luck. We set up our tents, eager to spend a night under the stars, with the sound of waves crashing against the shore. As darkness settled, the air grew colder, and an unsettling quiet fell over the beach. The wind died down, and even the waves seemed to soften, their rhythm eerie and hollow. We gathered around a small campfire, sharing stories and passing around snacks. That's when my friend Sarah brought up the legend of Hollow Beach. There's a reason this place is called Hollow Beach, she said, her voice low. They say it's haunted by the spirits of sailors who drowned here centuries ago. People claim that on certain nights, if you listen closely, you can hear them calling from the waves. We all laughed it off, but there was an undeniable chill in the air. The firelight cast long, strange shadows on the sand, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the darkness. Around midnight, Tom, who always loved a good dare, suggested we take a walk down the shoreline. None of us wanted to admit we were scared, so we agreed, grabbing our flashlights and heading toward the water. The beach was pitch black, our flashlights barely cutting through the thick darkness. As we walked along the shore, I noticed something odd. Small, pale objects scattered along the sand. Shells, maybe. I knelt down to pick one up, only to realize it was a piece of bone, smooth and worn by the waves. I dropped it immediately, my stomach twisting with unease. Guys, I think we should head back, I said, but no one seemed to hear me. Up ahead, Tom stopped abruptly, his flashlight pointing toward the water. Do you see that? He asked, his voice tense. We followed his gaze, and there, just beyond the surf, were shadowy figures standing in the water, unmoving and silent. They were faint, almost translucent, their shapes barely discernible in the darkness. It looked like a group of people, but their movements were unnatural, too slow, too deliberate. One by one, they turned toward us, their faces hidden in shadow. "Run!" someone shouted, breaking the spell. We turned and sprinted back toward our tents, tripping over each other in our desperation to get away. When we finally reached the campfire, we stopped to catch our breath, glancing back toward the shore. The figures were gone, but the air felt colder, heavier, as if something unseen was pressing down on us. We decided to stay close to the fire, hoping its warmth would keep the fear at bay. But as the night wore on, the strange happenings only grew worse. Our flashlights flickered on and off, strange whispers seemed to drift through the air, and the wind began to carry the faint sound of distant, sorrowful singing. Suddenly Sarah gasped, pointing toward the water. "Look!" In the distance, just beyond the shore, a pale, ghostly figure was rising from the waves. She wore a tattered dress, her hair flowing around her like seaweed. Her eyes were hollow, empty, and yet they seemed to be looking directly at us. She lifted her arm, as if beckoning us to come closer. "Pack up. We're leaving," I said, barely able to keep the panic from my voice. But as we hurried to gather our things, we realized something terrifying. Our belongings were scattered across the sand, our bags unzipped, our shoes and blankets tossed around as if someone, or something, had been rifling through them. Every instinct told me to run, but just as we turned to leave, the ground beneath us shifted. The sand felt softer, looser, like it was trying to pull us down. I stumbled, looking down to see pale, ghostly hands reaching up from the sand, grasping at my ankles. My friends screamed as they, too, struggled to break free from the grasping hands. Somehow we managed to pull ourselves out, stumbling toward the car with the eerie feeling that the entire beach was watching us, waiting for us to make a wrong move. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. As we sped away from Hollow Beach, I glanced back one last time. There, standing at the edge of the water, was the pale figure, watching us with empty, hollow eyes. I could have sworn she was smiling. We didn't speak for the rest of the drive. None of us wanted to acknowledge what we'd seen, what we'd experienced. But I knew one thing for certain. Whatever haunted Hollow Beach had no intention of letting us leave. To this day, I still hear whispers at night, faint calls echoing in my mind, like the haunting sound of waves on a dark, empty shore. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see her, a ghostly figure standing at the edge of the water, waiting for someone foolish enough to return. It all started with a late-night Reddit thread titled, "Do you want to learn the dark secrets of the internet?" Most people would ignore something like that, but my friend Jake, an aspiring programmer with a fascination for cybersecurity, couldn't resist. He was drawn to anything that promised a look behind the curtain of normal internet browsing. When Jake sent me the link, I thought it was probably just a hoax, or some hacker trying to bait people into downloading malware. But Jake assured me it was a legit lead that could teach him how to navigate the dark web safely. Against my better judgment, I agreed to help him. We decided to meet at his place that Friday night to dig into this hidden corner of the internet. When I arrived, Jake was already glued to his laptop, his face lit by the dim glow of the screen. "You have to see this," he whispered, his excitement barely contained. He'd followed a series of cryptic links that led him to a hidden forum. It was a simple black screen with lines of code and usernames flashing in and out. There were no pictures, no profiles, just messages from faceless users discussing everything from hacking techniques to spiritual data extraction, whatever that meant. A user named The Watcher kept appearing in different threads, each time with a new piece of cryptic advice. Jake was intrigued, typing back questions, asking for tips. I didn't think anything would come of it until suddenly, a private message popped up on his screen from The Watcher. It simply read, "You're in." The messages that followed grew darker. The Watcher claimed they had access to information that would change how we saw the world, but we had to follow every step they gave without question. Jake, curious and feeling a bit reckless, decided to play along. The instructions led him through a maze of backdoors and encrypted files. All the while, the Watcher seemed to know exactly what Jake was doing, as if watching in real time. That's when things started to get strange. Jake's screen began glitching, flickering as if someone else was taking control. Lines of code started scrolling across the screen, too fast for Jake to type. Panicking, he tried to shut down the laptop, but it wouldn't turn off. Instead, a message flashed in bold text. "You can't leave now." We both froze, staring at the screen in shock. Then the lights in Jake's apartment flickered. It was like something, or someone, had entered our world, watching us from the shadows. Suddenly, the webcam on Jake's laptop turned on by itself, and a face appeared in the corner of the screen, shadowy, with features hidden by darkness. The figure's eyes were unnaturally bright, almost hypnotic as they stared directly at us. "Stop trying to leave," the voice crackled through the speakers. It was distorted, as if layered with static. "You wanted to know the truth, didn't you?" Jake tried to close the laptop again, his hands trembling, but the screen wouldn't shut. The voice continued, mocking us, telling us that we'd crossed a line by attempting to peek into forbidden parts of the internet. "You were warned," the voice said, "but curiosity got the better of you." The laptop's screen began flashing images, strange, unsettling pictures of people's faces, all staring blankly, as if trapped. One of the faces looked eerily like Jake's, but before I could be sure, it vanished, replaced by lines of code that seemed to be rewriting themselves. Every attempt Jake made to regain control of his laptop was met with more interference, more cryptic messages, all of them saying things like, "Once you're seen, you can't hide, and there's no turning back." Then Jake's phone lit up with a notification. It was an email from an unknown address. The subject line read, "Do you think you're safe?" Opening it, we found a single image attached, a live photo of us sitting in Jake's apartment, taken just moments before. The angle suggested it had been taken from outside the window, but we were on the 3rd floor, and there was no balcony. Fear took over, and we decided to call the police. But before we could dial, Jake's phone shut down on its own, the screen going black. The lights in the apartment flickered again, and every electronic device suddenly powered down, leaving us in complete darkness. We scrambled to find flashlights, our breaths shallow and quick. I could feel my heart pounding as I heard the sound of footsteps outside the apartment door. They were slow, deliberate, as if someone was waiting for us to react. Jake held his breath, signaling me to stay silent. We stood there paralyzed, listening as the footsteps grew closer. Then, without warning, the door handle jiggled, as if someone was trying to get in. The footsteps retreated after a few moments, and the silence that followed was somehow even more terrifying. Jake's laptop suddenly powered back on by itself, casting a dim glow across the room. The screen was filled with a new message: "We are always watching." With shaking hands, Jake tried to type back, demanding to know who they were, what they wanted from us. The response was almost immediate. "We are what lies behind the code, the secrets you should have left buried. Curiosity has a price." The webcam turned on again, and this time the face was closer, clearer. It leaned in, as if it could see us just as well as we could see it. Its eyes were empty, cold, yet somehow aware, and it whispered, "You belong to us now." That was the final straw. We bolted from the apartment, running as fast as we could, not daring to look back. We spent the night at my place, not speaking of what happened. Jake left his laptop behind, abandoned with whatever haunted it. He was shaken, and though he never spoke of it again, I could see it in his eyes, that constant, lingering fear that he was being watched. Jake deleted his social media accounts, changed his phone number, and stopped all his online activities. But he kept receiving emails, anonymous messages from the watcher, reminding him that he could never truly escape. And sometimes, late at night, I still get messages too. Emails with strange, garbled text and images that disappear as soon as I try to view them. I'll never know who or what the watcher was, but every time I see my reflection in a screen, I feel like someone's staring back. When my friend Lucas, a fellow tech enthusiast, told me he'd discovered an abandoned fairground online, I thought he meant a photo album or a virtual tour, but this was something much darker. Lucas claimed he'd stumbled upon the Forgotten Fairgrounds files, a hidden collection of encrypted folders containing strange videos and logs left by hackers and data collectors who had explored the site themselves. One Friday night, Lucas invited me over to check out his findings. I wasn't usually into exploring the deep web, but his enthusiasm got the better of me. We sat in his dimly lit room, surrounded by computer monitors filled with lines of code and mysterious links. He'd managed to download a handful of files, each one labeled with a cryptic title like Carousel 033, Lost Operator, and The Last Clown. I didn't think much of it, just eerie names, probably files from some old ghost hunting expedition. As Lucas clicked on the first video file, we both leaned forward. The screen showed a shaky night vision recording of someone walking through the fairground, their flashlight scanning over rusted rides and broken-down game booths. The silence was deafening, broken only by the creak of metal and the occasional rustling in the darkness. But the creepiest part? There was someone else in the frame, a distant figure standing beside a broken carousel, barely visible. It wasn't moving, just standing there, staring straight at the camera. Lucas clicked on the second file, Lost Operator. This one was even stranger. It was a video log, recorded by someone who called themselves the Operator. They spoke in a low, raspy voice, narrating their experience as they moved through the fairground. At first it sounded like a typical exploration, describing each attraction, noting the eerie atmosphere. But then, their tone changed. The Operator started talking about the others. They described seeing figures moving through the fog, shadows lurking just beyond the lights. "They're always watching," the Operator whispered, their voice trembling. "Once you're in, they know your name. They'll follow you home." Lucas and I exchanged a glance, our unease growing. The Operator seemed genuinely terrified, breathing heavily as they stumbled through the fairground. At one point, they spun the camera around, capturing the face of a clown, a faded, peeling mask hanging from a broken game booth. The eyes of the clown seemed to glow, staring back at us as if it knew we were watching. Lucas decided to try one more file, The Last Clown. This one was different from the others. Instead of a video, it was a document filled with paragraphs of encrypted text and fragmented sentences. Lucas managed to decode some of it, revealing disjointed phrases like, "The Watchers are everywhere," "The fairground is their home," and "You can't leave once they see you." At the very end of the document, there was a single line that sent chills down my spine. "If you're reading this, they already know." Just as we processed the message, Lucas's computer screen glitched, flashing static before cutting to black. We both jumped, staring at the monitor in shock. A new window suddenly popped up, displaying an unfamiliar logo, a faded, sinister clown face with hollow eyes. Beneath it, a message appeared, "Welcome to the show." Lucas tried to close the window, but his mouse wouldn't move. The screen flickered again, and then the webcam turned on, showing both of us staring wide-eyed into the screen. A text box appeared below our image, reading, "You've been chosen to join us." The video feed cut to black, and the room went silent. A chill filled the air, making my skin crawl. I grabbed my phone, intending to call for help, but my screen was filled with the same sinister clown face, laughing silently at me. Suddenly, Lucas's speakers crackled to life. A distorted voice whispered, "Once you see us, we're everywhere." Then, from somewhere deep within the house, we heard the sound of laughter, the twisted, chilling sound of a clown's laugh. We bolted from the room, heading for the front door. But as we reached it, Lucas's phone buzzed in his pocket. The screen displayed a live feed from inside his house. Us, standing in front of the door, frozen with fear. And in the background, moving slowly closer, was the same shadowy figure we'd seen on the fairground video, emerging from the darkness with that haunting clown mask. We ran out of the house, not daring to look back, our hearts racing with terror. Lucas has since wiped his computer, trying to erase any trace of the files. But sometimes, when he turns his computer on, he still hears that soft, distorted laugh coming through his speakers. And late at night, I receive anonymous messages from unknown sources with cryptic phrases like, "You've been seen," or "Welcome to the fairground." Somehow, I know we'll never be able to escape it. The forgotten fairgrounds have left their mark, and wherever we go, the clowns, the watchers, are just a step behind, waiting for us to slip back into the dark. My friend Aaron was a software engineer and a curious hacker by nature. He spent his nights on dark web forums, searching for underground codes and hidden communities. One night, he told me he'd stumbled upon something called the Midnight Files, a mysterious set of documents rumored to contain secrets about government projects and strange paranormal experiments. I thought he was bluffing, but he seemed genuinely spooked. Despite my hesitation, I agreed to go to his place to check it out. I arrived around 11 p.m., finding him hunched over his laptop, his face illuminated by the faint glow of code and encrypted files. His screen was covered in symbols, unreadable at first glance, but Aaron seemed to be making sense of it. He showed me a folder filled with documents and videos, all labeled with strange titles like Echo Experiments, The Shadow Men, and File 000, Project Watchtower. We decided to start with Echo Experiments, and as Aaron opened the document, a wave of unease settled over us. The file contained descriptions of experiments where people were exposed to strange frequencies. Test subjects reported hearing whispers and seeing shadowy figures after exposure. They called it the echo effect because people claimed to hear things that weren't there, like echoes from another world. Each file became more disturbing. There were notes about researchers who'd gone missing, subjects who'd suffered severe psychological damage, and files mysteriously corrupted beyond repair. Aaron's eyes were glued to the screen, but I could see the nervous sweat on his forehead. He was starting to regret digging into this, but we were already in too deep. Then came the Shadow Men video. It was a grainy black and white clip showing a small, dimly lit room. In the corner of the room, a figure stood facing the wall, its head slightly tilted, unmoving. The timestamp showed the footage was hours long, but the figure didn't move once. Toward the end of the video, however, the figure slowly turned its head, revealing hollow, empty eyes that seemed to stare directly at the camera. The screen went black, and a single word appeared. Run. Aaron shut his laptop, visibly shaken. Maybe we should stop, he muttered, but there was something in his tone that hinted at both fear and curiosity. I encouraged him to continue, maybe foolishly, and he opened the final file. File 000, Project Watchtower. This one was different. It was encrypted and required a password. Just as Aaron was about to give up, his computer screen flickered, and the password field filled in on its own. The folder unlocked, revealing a live feed of what looked like a laboratory. The room in the feed was eerily empty, save for a single desk and a computer. Then, we saw someone enter the frame, a man in a lab coat, staring straight at us through the camera. It felt as if he knew we were watching. He sat down, opened a laptop, and typed something. A message appeared on our screen. "We know you're watching." Aaron panicked and tried to close the file, but it wouldn't respond. The man in the feed continued typing, his eyes fixed on us. The message changed. "You have gone too far. They're coming." We heard a faint buzzing noise coming from Aaron's speakers. It started low but quickly grew louder, turning into a distorted hum that filled the room. The lights flickered, and suddenly our screens turned to static. Just as we thought the nightmare was over, a final message appeared. "You've been marked." Aaron's phone buzzed with the notification. It was a text message from an unknown number. "Enjoy your new company." My phone buzzed too, and it was a photo of Aaron's room, taken from behind us. We whipped around, but there was nothing there, just the eerie silence of his empty apartment. The hum from the speakers faded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, watching, waiting. Aaron unplugged his laptop and swore to never go near the Midnight Files again. But that was weeks ago. Since then, we've both started noticing strange things. Whispers in empty rooms, the sensation of being watched, shadows that don't belong to anything. We tried to move on, but it's as if something latched onto us, like an invisible presence that followed us home. Every night, we still receive cryptic messages from unknown numbers. They're always the same. "Have you checked your shadows?" Or, "Are you sure you're alone?" And every time I look into a dark corner, I half expect to see that shadowy figure from the video, staring back at me with hollow eyes. Thank you for joining me on this journey tonight. I hope you found some peace and comfort. Before you drift off completely, let me know in the comments what time it is where you are and which country you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories. Until next time, rest well and sweet dreams.